Right. Well, there are a lot of people signing in and saying hi to everyone. So if the colleagues all think that it's time to start, let's do just that. My name is Martin Lutyens. I'm Edwin Lutyens' great nephew, and I'm the co-chairman of the Lutyens Trust in the UK and chairman of the Lutyens Trust America. And those two trusts joined forces at the start of our present pandemic to try to decide on a way to fill the gap that the present conditions leave in our events programs. And we finally, after some discussion, came up with the idea of a series of webinars which are going to take place over the next few weeks. I hope it's only a few weeks. I heard on the radio today that it might be a year. And what we're going to base those webinars on is there's a series of talks about the study and conservation of the works of Edwin Lutyens, because that really is the reason for the existence of the two trusts, the study and conservation of his works. The main brainchild of this series was Robin Prater, who's the executive director of the Lutyens Trust America, and he's had a huge amount of help from Marcus Lutyens, and not least from the panelists themselves. So on behalf of both the trusts, I'd like to welcome the last count, 265 participants in this first Edwin Lutyens Arts and Crafts Beginning.
We're having trouble understanding you for some reason. Maybe closer to the microphone or something.
Can you hear me better now?
That's much better.
All right. Okay. Well, apologies for that. I don't think anybody would welcome me starting all over again. But on behalf of both of the trusts, I'm welcoming all the 265 participants at the last count at this first Edwin Lutyens webinar. It's entitled Arts and Crafts Beginnings, the Story of Goddards. Now, Goddards itself I'll come to in a moment, but that of course is the main subject of the talk. But first I'd like to say just a few words about Edwin Lutyens himself, because there may be some people in the audience who don't really know who he is. He was born in 1869, and his career from his first serious work spanned about 56 years. And as his style evolved over time, it started with early arts and crafts houses. It moved on to grander houses, which were the ones that really made his name. Then on to public buildings, including the British Embassy in Washington, and on to the crowning achievement of his career, which was the design and building with his colleague Herbert Baker of New Delhi. Now, he also carried out a huge body of work, rather tragic work, for the Commonwealth, or at that time, the Imperial War Graves Commission, designing and having built some 150 cemeteries following the First World War, and building 5 enormous and very important memorials in France and Belgium. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. They are both eminent US architects, and both of them are fans of Edwin Lutyens, which I suppose is lucky, because that's what we'd like them to be. The first is Tom Kligerman of Ike Kligerman Barkley, which has offices in New York and San Francisco. And the other is Michael Imber of Michael G. Imber Architects, of the modern classical design firm based in San Antonio, Texas. And what they're going to do is to talk mainly about this house called Goddards, which is an early example of Lutyens' work. The picture on your screen is in fact of Lutyens, age 27, when his career was well underway, but he hadn't really moved on to the great buildings of his life. Goddards is an early house, and it is actually owned by the Lutyens Trust. It was left to us by a previous owner whose son was to have taken it on, but who very sadly died, and they kindly left it to the Lutyens Trust. We have our archive there and occupy part of the building for all the year round. For the rest of the year, it's on lease to an organization called the Landmark Trust. And the Landmark Trust own a portfolio of important and interesting buildings where people can go and stay. So if any of you are curious about going to live and stay in a Lutyens house, you can do so through the Landmark. Just a word back about Lutyens, and then I'll hand over to the panelists. There's many curious things about Edwin Lutyens. He was thought, and is still thought by many people, to have been the greatest British architect of his day, or some of them the greatest British architect ever. It's really curious that he had almost no formal education, but he had extraordinary natural gifts of mathematics, drawing skills, sense of proportion, and he had, as Tom mentioned before, a wicked sense of humor, which he used to good effect to amuse his customers and to get himself out of awkward situations. So without further ado, oh yes, I better just mention the timing. The overall timing is intended to be 45 minutes, and of that 30 minutes will be a slideshow by Tom and Michael, and then there will be 15 minutes of Q&A at the end.
Right.
Okay, over to Tom and Michael, please.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I hear some feedback. I don't know if that's going to continue, but thank you everybody for joining us. Just a couple things. One is I just want to let everybody know that I think every photograph you will see they're all photographs that were taken by members of the Lutyens Trust America as we traveled to England to visit Goddards, which you see in this photograph here. This is the west side of Goddards with the sunlight coming in the afternoon. And we'll see this picture again as we get into more about the house itself. But Goddard, this is the cover of the pamphlet that we had when we went on our trip. The trip was last October, as you can see. There were 18 of us, and we were lucky to live in Goddards, as Martin mentioned. You can go live in it, and it's rented for days or I think a week at a time, and it is absolutely worth doing. It's located in Surrey, and we inserted this map just to let people know where Surrey was. I had no idea till I got there, but it's just southwest of London, and you can almost imagine it's like Greenwich is to New York City. You can live in this beautiful wooded countryside, and you can commute into London if you want. And there are trains and things like that, which is how people at the time this house was built would get out to this part of the world. So you can see it there, the county of Surrey. It is, I think, the most wooded county in England. And here is a photograph of a lane, I think a photograph that Michael Imber took. And maybe, Michael, you want to talk a little bit about the experience of actually being there and seeing his early work.
Yeah, there seems to be a little bit of a lag, Tom, on the slides from my end anyway. But, you know, one of the things that really interested me about this trip, and what interested me in general, is the story. And we got a lot of the story on this little trip that we had. We called it an intensive because it was just a few short days that we spent here, spending time with experts on Lutyens and understanding his life. And this is a small country lane adjacent to the country home that Sir Edwin Lutyens grew up in. You know, he lived in a townhouse in London. If you can imagine, London at that time was a center of industry and was dark and grimy, and people, you know, wanted to get out to the fresh air of the countryside. And his family had a small home in this village of Thursley, and his father was a painter of horses in this small area of Surrey that had plenty of horses to paint. Lutyens was one of 13 children, so there was quite a household. And yeah, he grew up in this small village, and he was quite curious. He would go down to the local churchyard, St. Michael's, where craftsmen were busy working on this small church, and just soak up all of the craftsmanship that was happening. Watching these workmen work with stone and timber and putting this small charming building together, and that was really very influential to his beginnings. So from there, Lutyens, he did go to school for a couple of years in South Kensington, and then went to work for Ernest George for a short period of time in London, where he worked with, where he met his longtime friend and colleague, Herbert Baker. But he didn't spend much time there. He ended up coming back to Surrey, ended up coming back to the village. This is a picture of me that, the practice that Lutyens had was roaming the countryside and sketching over glass with soap to learn the proportions and composition of these small country village buildings. So anyway, came back to Thursley and was quickly became involved with construction. This is a little cottage that eventually became the Village Institute. But at the age of 19, Lutyens did his first modification of this building. And you can see a little bit of Lutyens play with this chimney, the humor of a chimney mast, but yet, there appears to be rooms inside of it. And then, this was also, a period where, arts and crafts was gaining its moniker, and coming out of the period of the Victorian age, where these Victorian houses were being built, in this romantic style. This is Lutyens' first large commission, Crooksbury, which we got to visit. And this is the front elevation, which still pretty well remains intact. But you see the half timber construction, the very romantic and almost haphazard relationships of massing, chimneys shooting up wherever they are. You begin to see a little bit of Lutyens, on the right-hand side, with the chimney, cascading down into an ingle nook. But this was, he was very interested in this, romantic style in the beginning, which was, what you were seeing coming out of, architects like Norman Shaw and the like, who Lutyens followed very closely. Then, he ended up, after going to a tea party, being invited to have tea with Gertrude Jekyll. They hit it off. She loved his sense of humor. She was an avid amateur photographer. They would take these carriage rides throughout the English countryside, looking at vernacular architecture. And she would be photographing them, and they would be talking about the architecture together. And she had a small piece of property across the street from her family's house, and had asked, this young Lutyens, in his early 20s, to design a home for her. Now you begin to see, these influences of arts and crafts come into play, where, things become much more about the materiality, the house growing out of the landscape, feeling as though it's embedded in the woods. Here's one of our photographs of Munstead Wood, this home that Gertrude Jekyll worked on with Lutyens. Much more about the materiality. They harvested, oak and chestnut from the property to build the house. So this was, very much a collaboration between Gertrude Jekyll and Lutyens. But you begin to see some of the Lutyens' play of materials begin to come out in this house that he did for her. The funny thing was, Lutyens' nickname for Gertrude was Bumps. And I've always been kind of curious where that came from, but no telling what he was referring to there. Yeah, so then, what we saw at Munstead Wood was something very arts and crafts, very organic, still had, that kind of medieval quality to it. But then, we start, getting into Tickborne Court, which was built approximately the same time as Goddards. And all of a sudden you see a more of a play of formality come into Lutyens' work. Even elements of classicism, very formal play of the floor plan coming and somewhat colliding with the vernacular house. And again here, you see his interest in materials with the varget stones and the garroted joints in the detailing. I think there's a closer image here, if it would come up, where he really begins to have an interplay between the different materials of the house.
Michael, I've posted, for some reason, it takes a long time for these images to post. The detail you're talking about with the brickwork and the tile and the flint has actually been up on the screen for a bit. I'm not sure why. I don't know what other people are seeing. But.
Well, another thing that was, you see here the chimney on the right-hand side, leaving this little play of light in between the masses of the brick of the chimney. Here you see the garroted joints using the local stone, which was again a very local vernacular expression of craft in the area. But then Lutyens really has this play with the roof tile, and you see this wonderful pattern that interjects itself into this classical motif.
Michael, I'm going to move on to God, if it's okay, to Goddards itself. I think maybe your computer is on a delay. I think if everybody can see it now, there's
Tom, that's it. Please do.
Oh, okay, I apologize. I hope that the slides are keeping pace with what I'm going to be saying, but on the screen is a map of the immediate area of Abinger Common, which is the town that Goddards is located in. And if you can see my cursor, the house is located right on the road. It's right here. You can see this H-shaped building sort of in the middle of the screen. And you drive up to the property along this kind of a chasm of mud and trees. It's very dark. You feel like Robin Hood's men are about to jump out on you. And you finally rise up and up and up, and you come across the house. And it suddenly appears behind this hedge, these two massive chimneys, skinny, popping up into the sky.
Hey, and Tom, slow down a little bit. You're way behind on the slides.
Oh, boy.
You're still on the map. Sorry.
Oh, I apologize, everybody. Maybe someone who's watching other than Michael could text me.
Now we have the road through the woods.
I've got the hedge and the house now.
Okay, I apologize, everybody. We're just working this out. Am I way ahead of the images, or
now you have the hedge. You're good.
Michael, I'm asking Martin and other people. Am I just, someone can confirm? I just can't tell
we got the hedge in the house.
All right, I'll keep going. So I think we mentioned Lutyens' humor. I think one of the things that right off the bat when you get to the house is you find not only the two chimneys over the hedge, but two gateways into the property. And I've just put up on my screen a detail of one of the gates, but you have to choose one gate or the other, and you finally go in and you pass through the hedge. You can see here, you can begin to see the house appearing in the distance. And you finally get in only to realize that both of those gates lead to the exact same place. So you're given this choice, which in the end is really not a choice. In any case, I wanted to show you a floor plan of the house. The house was built in 2 stages. It was built by a man named Frederick Mirrlees, who was born in Russia in 1851. He was of Scottish descent. He married a Scottish woman whose father was very wealthy. Mirrlees went to work for his father-in-law, and ended up becoming the head of a steamship company called the Union Castle Steamship Line. And he built this house in 1900 as a place for young women. His quote was, "It was a house of rest to which ladies of small means might repair." I think it was mostly people who worked for him, women who worked for him, could go to this little house and have a holiday that they otherwise couldn't afford. And I pause on this slide for a minute just to show you how it looked in 1910. It was a bunch of little small square rooms. You can see the parlor and the studio. There was a main room, which was the hall, which is where most of the activity took place. We'll revisit this plan in a minute, because in 1910, he expanded the building. But when it was first built, this is what it looked like in this contemporary sketch. And this is what it looks like today from the road. The changes that came later are more obvious on the garden side of the building. So here it is. This is a picture taken one rainy morning. Oddly, it rained while we were in England. This is the front of the building. You can see it's very spare and simple. If the slides are keeping up with me, there's the front door on the left. Over it is a wonderful stone carving. You know, I read that he collected things from people, Lutyens collected things from people in the village. People might have some plates or some tile, and he would take those things and he would sort of incorporate them in the design of the house. But I want to show you what happened. In 1910, he basically asked all the young ladies to not come back, and he redesigned the house, Lutyens, so that Miralles, the ship magnate, could give the house to his son and his son's new bride as a wedding gift. And here you can see how it expanded to the west and how those arms became longer. The shape of the building became a little bit more complex. You can see in this room on the right, for example, that apsoidal shape. I'll show you a picture in a second. And the function of the rooms moved. This wing became the dining room. The common room was essentially the living room. The former dining room became a servant's hall. The house became fancier. Even the addition of a shed on the right for the sort of all the things you need when you're a fancy house owner. And this is what the house looks like today as you approach it. You can see how complicated it's become, how the massing is interesting. He puts more of those chimneys on that are even more complicated. And you walk around the house. Here's another shot when the sun came out. And you see at the ends of these elongated wings, these incredible sort of piled up chimney masses with tile roof and slate and beautiful stucco and stonework at the base. It became a much more elaborate house, really much more of a house for a private individual than a simple building for women of small means. Here you can see we're coming into the courtyard. You can see that wonderful afternoon sunlight. Here's that photograph. Again, I hope the pictures are keeping up with me. Here it is at the west. The house, the arms kind of open. They aren't perpendicular to one another. They splay, almost like arms welcoming the sunlight at the end of the day, sort of welcoming you in. And then you can see his gardens. These gardens were done by Gertrude Jekyll. Remember, Michael mentioned she was that was Bumps, and she was called Bumps because she was sort of low and hunched and slightly overweight, and he called her Bumps. She looks like a bump in all of his caricatures. These gardens were designed by Jekyll in coordination with Lutyens. Here you see more into the courtyard, and the back door is in the corner of there. We actually use the back door as the front door in our time there because that's really how you enter the property right now. One last thing before Michael talks about materials, you know, he was very aware of the sunlight. So you see on this north arm of the house, there's a window bay with big windows in it. Now those were big because they let the sunlight in the wintertime. You could sit there and be warm. And opposite it, facing north, the same shape, but because it's facing north and not as much sunlight, the windows are much smaller. So lots of little plays with the symmetry of this building. Again, the back door, which we used as the front door there. Michael, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the materials in the courtyard and the materials of the house.
Is there a plan nearby that we can go back to very quickly?
No.
All right. Well, you know, again, you know, you saw earlier in the period of Lutyens' early career that floor plans were very loose and piled on, but he quickly began to formalize those plans, and that was one of the characteristics of Lutyens' work. Is he really delighted in the possibility of the plan. And one of the interesting things is, if you may have noticed the plan of the garden in the plan that Tom was showing in the floor plan, it was quite a study in geometry and was really quite complex, of these shifting circles. But yet it doesn't read that way in reality. And again, it's Lutyens going back to this idea of arts and crafts, and which was, architect should always be judged by his understanding of the materials. And so here you see him using what was called this primitive stoniness to offset the formality of the plan. And there's this play between the rusticity of the materials and the geometries that he's using. So Tom, going on to the, I don't know if there's a lag here.
Oh, there's a lag, Michael. I'm showing the details. I'm showing the millstones he used in the courtyard. He would find things.
So go on, go on from there. And so, Lutyens, during this time, was really paying attention to what was going on with, other arts and crafts architects. He was a big fan of Philip Webb. And you see here on the left, Munstead Wood, in an earlier gestation of his thought of materials, where stone was really expressed as being, quote, very stony, and really understanding the grain of the yoke and how it goes together, and really using the character of the materials to manifest itself into the detail. And then on the right, you see Goddards, which is much more thoughtful, much more refined, much more tailored than what you see in the earlier work of Munstead Wood. Here again, you see Munstead Wood and the rusticity of the materials that he pulled together. Here, the little plaque to Lutyens that Gertrude Jekyll memorialized him with in her little covered porch looking out towards her garden. And you see that contrast with Goddards and the relationship of the materials here. The relationship of the texture of the plaster with the regularity of the slightly smaller brick that he used here. And then, rather than the ruggedness of the stone that you saw at Munstead Wood, there was a more refinement, much more refinement. Him even taking, in a very Lutyens way, delight in inserting roof tiles into the stone pattern. Here you see, his play of pattern with the brick, and it's contrasting against the render of the plaster work.
So I hate to do this to you, Michael, but there's the plan you were looking for.
Well, there you have it. It's him. It was Philip Webb was all about taking architecture out of the office and putting it into the mason's yard or to the builder's yard. Right. Lutyens here at Goddards and at Tickborne Court is beginning to take it back to architecture with capital A, with his strong use of the plan.
So here the plan is, again, I want to show it to everybody one more time. This is the 1910, this is the one that was built, that exists now. This is 1910. And we're going to look at 3 rooms in addition to some details. The first room is labeled here as the dining room. We'll look at that. That's now actually sort of the lounge of the salon. You can see, by the way, the size of these hearths. You'll see them in the photographs. You can actually sit in the fireplace. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the common, oops, I'm going too fast there. The common room, which at the time in 1910, when the women of small means were living there, that's really where they hung out. That's where they played games and stuff like that. Speaking of playing games, the last room we'll look at is the Skittles Alley, which is essentially a sort of, don't take this wrong, anybody in the UK, kind of a primitive English version of what we think of as bowling, with all our machines and the racket and the rock music and the pizza slices. We'll look at that room, which was where we spent a lot of time, and it was really fun. And I think if you were a young woman of limited means, it was probably a pretty exciting place to be. This is the former dining room, now the lounge. We spent a lot of time in here at the end of the day having cocktails and talking. You can see that giant hearth at the end. You know, the fireplace actually sits within the hearth, which in some ways is a miniature room or almost a window bay. The hearth really becomes bigger. It plays a huge important role in the room. You know, the hearth is the home. The cabinet on the right, we think, was a Lutyens design. Looks very much like a lot of the work he did in his furniture design, places like New Delhi and stuff where he designed all the furniture. And when you turn around, this is the curved end of the room. It wasn't curved in 1900 when the young women were living there. It was just a square box. It was very simple. And you can see how by 10 years later, from between 1910, first version, 1900, the first version, 1910, and the redo, it gets fancier, and he's already beginning to work in classicism. The details in these cabinets are similar to those in this house. This is a room in Heathcote, which was built in 1908, just 2 years before he did the renovation of Goddards. And you can see he's gone completely classical, but he still finds time to kind of put it into Goddards when he makes it into a private house. Now we're going to move into the hall. This is a drawing from 1900. There you see some poor, unfortunate women on their holiday. And this room, you can see, was set up as a place to play games. You sit by that fireplace. You can get a sense of the timber that Michael was talking about. You can see it comes almost directly from that church in Thursley, St. Michael's. But really an incredible room. This is an image I saw as a student, and it never dawned on me that one day I would actually be in this room, and better yet, get to live in this house with 15 of my friends. Here's the room today. As I mentioned before, it's used as the dining room, and it is a spectacular room. It has windows on both sides. There you see that giant timber. You see his use of brick, that incredible squinch, that sort of funnel-shaped brick, almost becoming a keystone over the fireplace in the distance. The Trust and others have furnished it really beautifully with paintings. I forget the story of these paintings. Maybe we can come back to that later. Look at the door detail, those incredible cross braces, the timber work, the whole idea of craft. You know, they're sort of rebelling against all the commercialism and all the factory built stuff. This is all about guilds and people working and craftsmen doing wood or brick. This is the Skittles Alley. On the left, that's where you sit while you're waiting for your turn. There's a little fireplace there under those antlers. And then on the right, you're looking down the alley at the actual pins, which have these pads around them. So when you roll the ball down there, they don't go bouncing all over the place. On the right, you put there's someone who goes down there. I'll show you in a second. And someone's job is to pick up all the pins, put them in place, pick up the ball, which weighs about 400 pounds, drop it into that trough, and it rolls back to where you're sitting in those benches on the left side. You can see the trough with the balls on the left waiting to be used. Here is a close-up at night of that area where the balls bounce around and collect in that sort of carpeted area. That's Oliver Cope, who was an architect in New York City, a good friend who had the unenviable job that night of picking up the pins. It's very dangerous. You risk your life down there because there was a lot of drinking that went on, much to the chagrin of our neighbors. In fact, you have to stop playing at 10 o'clock because it gets incredibly loud between the crashing of the balls and the crashing of the pins and the drinking, which eventually leads to situations like this. This is Michael Imber, noted architect, last bowl of the evening where you can't even stand up, but he's determined.
I think this would have been scandalous if it would have been during the young ladies period.
Well, this is the picture where you had your clothes on, Michael. Anyway, I want to
Scotch Skittles.
That's a glimpse of being in the house. And what I didn't show is the bedrooms upstairs are very cozy. You know, when it was built in 1900, the rooms were tiny. in 1910, when he expanded it, one of the things he did was he gave two sort of generous bedroom suites on the ends of those wings, and made it into a fancy house. So, Michael, maybe you want to talk a little bit about some of the details inside.
Well, again, you see Lutyens delighting in the craft of this house. Everything is thoughtful. A handle isn't just a handle. On the left here, you actually see the beginnings of his kind of famous oval-shaped knob that he uses in a lot of his house, but here, carved in wood. And then, the mechanism, the lock on the right. Tom, do you have a picture of the doorbell, or am I lagging?
That's coming. That's coming, but I have a series of slides showing the hierarchy of hardware, those being the fancy.
Yeah. And this being the more utilitarian, simplified versions.
But not so much so, because as you get into the bedrooms and stuff, this is actually the master bedroom, where the hardware is not as fancy as the first one, but still fancier than some of the other rooms. Here you can see this rim lock on the left and these simple brass knobs.
There you see, Lutyens' custom design of knob there on the right.
One thing is to tell everybody, I've rarely been in a house that was so considered at every turn, every material, every surface. He thought about everything. That there's nothing that wasn't designed or in some ways loved from a design point of view. The evidence of his design ability and his hand is everywhere, like these windows. Michael, if you want to talk about them a little bit.
Yeah, again, wood had to feel like wood, brick had to feel like brick, and here glass feels like glass, and really ends up painting the materials with light.
Yeah, it was great. Every place you walked, the windows were different. You can see those little round ones on the right. There's that little. That's a medieval woman of meager means, and maybe a little reference to who might be living in the house in 1900. And you see that hand-blown detail in that when they're looking down into the courtyard. And the windows aren't very big, but you never have a sense that the house is dark. It's it's cozy and yet light at the same time.
And I like this picture here because I think this really speaks to the times. Here you on the right, you have the servant's buzzer, which was modern technology at the time. But actually, the English at the time kind of reviled that buzz from electricity. And here on the left, you see Lutyens' version of the doorbell. And again, during this period of arts and crafts, the English delighted in taking hold of a bent iron rod that comes through a hole in the wall. When you pull that, it rings this ancient mechanism in the hallway. Really hearkening back to an earlier simple time. And then
lurch
really expressing the craft of the craftsman.
Go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead, Tom.
I just said, you imagine ringing that doorbell on the left and the door creaks open and there's Lurch from the Addams Family standing there to welcome you.
Or Tom.
Well, that's my second career. The other thing, just as we begin to close, the fireplaces are incredible. And that fireplace on the left is in the hall, now dining room. You can see a glimpse on the left back to what's now the breakfast room. That was actually in the old days on the left back there. That was the dining room for the young ladies. Now the dining room is this big room. And I put this in again because the slide on the left kind of sums up the house almost. The use of brick, the timber, the fireplace where you stepped up, again, that enormous flaring, squinch of brick that comes out. You wonder how it stays up there. You're almost afraid to stand underneath it. And on the right, that's in the master bedroom. An incredible use of tile instead of brick surrounding the fireplace. That magnificent hexagonal stone that it's almost like a double-sided keystone. It's almost as though he took a keystone and then mirrored it above to create a hexagon. That's a detail that shows up in other work of his, notably a Castle Drogo in Devon, which is a medieval castle he designed in the 1930s. And they're the hinges we talked about. The master bedroom has sort of fancy hinges, not as fancy as the other rooms, but pretty darn nice.
Well, and Tom, I just wanted to say, going back to that last slide that you're on, again, I like these two photographs because it kind of shows two sides of Lutyens. You've got the one on the left where you see what grows out of the floor plan and the geometry of the floor plan. And you have, objects on top of objects. You have objects inserted within, objects. That's not a flat wall, it's actually a faceted wall. And then you have this squinch springing from that, and then the fireplace inserted within. And then you see Lutyens taking a completely two-dimensional surface and delighting in how he put together the material on that.
For the architects listening, and maybe if others can follow me, if you look on the left, that angle, you see the way the brick wall kind of angles off to the left. That angle is there because it aligns with those splayed arms. If you imagine looking out the window, the angle of that brick becomes the angle of the wall of the house outside. And in order to maintain the symmetry at the end of the room around that fireplace, he tilts that other wall back at the same angle. So the whole thing becomes a symmetrical composition, but the angles are derived from the overall form, the sort of splayed form of the courtyard, the overall mass of the building.
Right. What really feels almost haphazard in the plan, almost medieval in the plan, is really well considered.
These are a couple views. This is the big fireplace you saw at the end of the salon. You can see a little south light coming in that window on the left there, the brick and the tile. I just want to point out that chair is the Napoleon chair that Lutyens designed. A bit of shameless promotion. Candia Lutyens has a company that makes that chair. If anybody's interested, any designers listening in, they're incredibly comfortable because you can sit in that chair and you can sling a leg over the lower arm. And they look great when you put a pair together because one has a low arm on the left, one has a low arm on the right, and they can make a nice sort of symmetrical composition around the fireplace, like the one on the right. There you see in the evening the blazing fire. And this is the room. On our trip, we invited guests to come speak, and we had conversations at the end of the day. We would go out, we would look at Chinthurst and these other houses by Lutyens, and we would come back, and we had kind of amazing people come talk to us, considering we were such a small group. On the left is Lady Wedgwood. For people listening, that's Mrs. Wedgwood of the Wedgwood pottery family. I know that some of you listening collect that. I've seen on Instagram. Ankie Barnes, a friend who's an architect who may be listening in. And then standing on the right is Clive Aslett, who's an architectural historian who knows an enormous amount about Lutyens. Totally charming, hilarious guy. And he would lead these conversations, and they were really fun. We would be drinking, and then we'd go in for dinner afterwards. And tucked in the corner is our bowling setter-upper, Oliver Cope. There's a bunch of pictures I had of this, and every one of them, Oliver's looking at his cell phone. I picked this one because he's actually listening to Clive. But these are really fun evenings. The other thing that we did on the trip, and this is just the more human side, we would get up in the morning, a group of us, that's me on the left, Ankie Barnes, Doug Wright, who's an architect in New York City, and Michael. We would get up at 7 or 6:30, and we'd go out and we would paint. And it was a lot of fun, and I included a few of our little watercolors of Goddards. This is mine sitting looking through a little orchard of apple trees, I think they are. Michael painted a detail of those massive chimney blocks at the end of the house as it exists today. I painted this one actually after returning. This is the house as you approach it today around the back of the building. But one of the great things about traveling with friends is this sort of getting to not only look at architecture, but also to spend time together. Some people get up in the morning and do yoga, but we did painting. This is me saying goodbye to everybody from one of the windows in that north window bay, enjoying the ever-present English sun. I just wanted to conclude with a little bit more shameless promotion, and we can go on to questions and stuff afterwards. We are having another trip this fall to Devon. There are some spots left if anybody wants to join us. I can tell you they're really fun trips. That's Castle Drogo on in the photographs. On the left, that's the outside. That's a stair hall on the right. And we'll be visiting this sort of insider's tour. The trip is set for the 14th to the 17th. Just so everybody's comfortable, if it turns out because of the coronavirus we can't go, you will get a full refund. So sign up. Your money is safe with us. But anyway, I think that concludes our presentation part of the lecture. I'd love to get any questions people might have. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but I think someone's going to forward us questions, and we'll you can say who you want to answer them. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, Tom, you can open up your chat. There's a chat going on.
Oh.
You can see questions.
Oh. Really?
Yeah, we've got one question which is from Gary Searle, is with so little formal training, how did Lutyens manage the incredible engineering of his projects? For example, the dome over Viceroy's house in Delhi. Did he rely on engineers in his office, or did he acquire the skills himself to develop his aesthetic brilliance?
I can take a stab at it, and Martin, everybody can weigh in. You know, here's what happens in the world of architecture. There's something called an structural engineer, and you know, you work very closely with them. And I imagine early on in these houses like this one, that there's nothing particularly difficult to engineer these buildings. These things were probably just engineered by Lutyens' instinctual and historical understanding of the local buildings. Plus you have craftsmen who deal in timber and brick, and they know how to do it. By the time you're as famous as he becomes, certainly in New Delhi, but even before that, houses like Heathcote and some of the really big ones, he probably was working with a structural engineer of some sort. Certainly in New Delhi, that couldn't have been done without professional consulting.
Well, but there was also, I think, you know, coming out of this arts and crafts period, it was well known that Lutyens really understood his materials, and he carried that forward even when he began working with steel. And in New Delhi, building the dome of the Viceroy's house, they actually used a traditional method where they would line up people all the way around the dome. Each had 2 bricks in their hands, and at the beat of the drum, they would place the bricks in place and hold them until they dried in the hot sun. So the idea of craft continued through all the way to the end of his career.
Martin, why don't you curate the questions?
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Right. There was one there a moment ago from Robert Farrell. Hello, Robert. Was there a kitchen garden? Well, I'm afraid there may be people listening who know the answer to that, but I'm not quite sure. There's a huge, great greenhouse. And yes, I come to think about it, it would have been on the south side of the house. The house basically faces east and west, but on the south side, there's a sloping part of the property that slopes away, and there's a big greenhouse there. And I think that the kitchen garden must have been there.
You know, I see a question, Martin. Someone asked about the bricks at Danehill Brick and Tile Works. I don't know if these bricks, I think these bricks were local, but this is a question from Ann Lott. At some point in his career, maybe Martin, you know, he begins to really only purchase bricks from one company called the Daneshill Brick and Tile, and he actually designs their showroom. He designs a beautiful brick building for them. But I think this is before that might have happened. Martin, do you know?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer. If Anne is really interested, I can easily find out. But I think that Daneshill, his connection with the Daneshill bricks came later on. I think.
I think so too. I think I remember reading that pretty much everything you see in this house was either quarried or cut or fabricated locally.
So the next question from Mary Netherly was, how much influence did Gertrude Jekyll have on Lutyens in cultivating local craftsmen? A lot, I would say. I think that was one of the things that formed their close friendship, was their love of the vernacular architecture and the use of local craft. And she brought that into her own home at Munstead Wood. So the relationship was built on that, and they continued that relationship, well on after their first carriage rides together.
We've got some questions in the Q&A window as well. I don't know if you can see those.
Why don't you? I can't talk and read at the same time. Maybe you want to read one.
Sure, absolutely. For instance, any connection of plan Slade single depth rooms to ES Pryor's butterfly plans, and also comment on relation to E. Lutyens's raised Papillon House. So are there any connections there?
The connection I see is, I think, Papillon Hall, which has been torn down. It was an incredible house with beautiful circular courtyard, and it's gone now. But I guess the connection might be just the angled wings. And it, like this house, those extremities, those ones that formed the butterfly plan were, if I remember right from the plan, had exposures on at least two sides. Michael, are you familiar with that building?
I am familiar, but other than it just being a much more formalized exercise in the Slade plan, perhaps he evolved from Goddard to really begin to explore how far he could take that concept.
So another question is, Joanne Mizoff stayed at Goddards 15 years ago and remembered the details, such as the little cupboards in the bedroom where my youngest son left his teddy. He confessed when we were halfway home. My question is, given the exquisite details for absolutely everything, why has there not been a resurgence of arts and crafts style in the later 20th, early 21st century?
Michael?
I think that, I definitely, it's a big interest in our work. Local craftsmen are definitely a part of the work that we do. And I think it's just as important today, in this world of globalization, to really understand localization and, what materials are available and what craftsmen are available to fashion those materials into the homes we live in today. So I don't think it's dead at all. I think we really, I know Tom does as well, try to exercise that as much as feasible in today's architecture.
Yeah, I think the thing that if you do sort of high-end residential is that all of these crafts are available today. Leaded glass, cut stone, cabinetry, cast bronze. It's all available, and it's something that has been growing over the last 30 years since I've been an architect.
That's what's amazing to me is 30 years ago, it was very difficult to find a local craftsman.
I think the thing that keeps it from happening more is simply the cost. It's expensive. It's just
right.
Expensive to do. But I think you use those things as much as you can. You put your fanciest materials and craftsmanship in the rooms that people see, and then you sacrifice it in the rooms that aren't as important. But all of this work exists today, and I think there is a resurgence.
Yeah, and I think further to further that, I think we see it as that's the best way to give a building meaning, is really when you really do see the hand of the craftsman. And an understanding of the materiality. So I think that's another reason why Lutyens still resonates so much today is because of these early beginnings of his.
Why don't we take one more question, because we're beyond our 45 minutes. And Marcos, why don't you pick?
Yeah, I like this question. It does seem that you both have been admirers of Lutyens for a long time. How have his designs influenced both of you?
Tom, you want to begin?
His work, there's a lot of things. One is the craft, which we've already talked about. The other is, we borrow from him both literally and sometimes more, less so. The first kind of the house that put us on the map, put Ike Kligerman Barkley on the map, was a dark green shingle interpretation of Folly Farm. We don't have any images to show you now, but Folly Farm was an arts and crafts house that Lutyens worked on several times. I think in 1912 or so, he put this amazing giant roofed end on the house with big brick piers and a pool and stuff like that. But it's brick and timber and stucco and tile. It's all kinds of materials. We took that and tweaked the proportions and did the whole thing in shingle as one of our sort of shingle. We call it our Shinglish house. It's a shingle style house with English roots. So sometimes literally like that. Other times, you know, I think with anybody who's interested in traditional architecture, or certainly classicism, you look at the proportions of things, and Lutyens was a genius at sort of proportions and mathematical ratios and stuff. And even if the building we're working on doesn't necessarily look like a Lutyens building, I think we're trying to think in that way and borrow his way of thinking as much as the actual product he designed.
Yeah, and for us, I think it really, what really resonates with us was his understanding of formality, but yet his use of inventiveness, that he knew where to be correct when he was correct, but he always kind of bent things to have its own personality. And sometimes he would take that to the extreme, especially, you know, being humorous at times. And I think that's what architecture should be about. I don't think it ought to be a stiff set of canons. I think personally, you know, it should be a personal evolution, and he was the master at that.
Hey, maybe a word or two of closing. Martin, we didn't rehearse the closing. Do you want to be the bookend, beginner and ending speaker?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed to the two panelists, and thanks to the everyone who's signed in. It's wonderful to have such an enthusiastic, well, they are enthusiastic according to the notes that I'm seeing coming up on my screen here. The participants, very pleased.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And thanks to very much to everyone who's been involved in the backup to this, especially my son Marcus Lutyens, who's been behind the scenes, pulling the strings and making the technology work. And also, of course, Robin Fraser, the executive director of the Lutyens Trust in America. A little thing that you may object to my saying, but I am going to mention that the pandemic is causing problems to the revenues of both of our organizations through the cancellation of our events. And, you know, if you've enjoyed this this webinar and hopefully the rest of them in the series, you might consider making a modest donation to one or other of the organizations to help us. And you'll be getting an email in the next day or two with details of how to do that. So thank you all very much indeed. And by UK time, a very good evening.
Well, thank you, Martin. We've really enjoyed being a part of this discussion, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending, and we hope you'll attend our next webinars.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Great.